In the brittle, bone-deep chill of winter, 1892, a strange sound began drifting through the bougainvillea-scented air of Mexico City's most prestigious neighborhood. The whispers began softly uncertain, breathless, before blooming into full-blown dread. From behind the ornate stone walls of a grand mansion on Tuba Street came screams. Not cries of protest, not the desperate clash of rebellion or the random chaos of street violence. No, these were far worse. These were screams that carried the unmistakable timbre of pure methodical agony. Cries so piercing, so unnaturally precise in their rhythm and repetition, that even hardened policemen men who had patrolled the bloodied alleys of President Porfirio Diaz's fractured capital would later confess in whispers and drink-fueled admissions that they haunted their dreams for years. And if you're still with us, listening in the quiet of your home, your car, or the edge of sleep, let me gently warn you, this is not a tale of ghosts or ancient curses. What you're about to hear is real, and in many ways, it's more terrifying. What happened inside that mansion would not only shock the city, but rattle the very foundations of a nation attempting to civilize itself. Hidden behind lace curtains and carved balconies was the mind of a woman so cold, so precise in her cruelty, that historians would later name her Mexico's first documented female serial killer. Her name, Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano. But to those who heard the screams, who saw what was later uncovered within her home, she was something else entirely. They called her La Horrenda, the terrifying one. And yes, before we go any further, if stories like these were horror hides behind velvet curtains, and the most trusted hands conceal the cruelest acts, if these are the truths you feel deserve to be remembered, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe to Sleepy History Tales. Tap that notification bell, gently like a knock on an old door. And if you're still awake, tell us in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? What corner of the world have our paths met in? Because this story, like so many we explore here, has been nearly erased, not by time, but by shame. Silenced not because it lacked witnesses, but because too many people refused to believe what they had seen. Let's go back to 1887. Mexico City was beating with strange divided pulses. Gas lamps flickered along its freshly paved avenues. Horse-drawn carriages bearing French perfume and imported silk glided past barefoot children who hadn't eaten in days. President Diaz's modernization had brought railroads and electricity, but also widened the chasm between the elites and the forgotten. In that complex, glittering world, Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano was the perfect embodiment of upper-class virtue. At 43, she wore her widowhood like a badge of dignity. Her late husband's fortune had been preserved, some whispered, expanded through her quiet, exacting business skills. And the social standing she maintained was ironclad. Her mansion on Tuba Street was a pink limestone jewel with wrought iron balconies tangled in flowering vines and a columned entryway that inspired envy. Guadalupe herself was tall, severe, and always impeccably dressed in black. Her hair was pulled so tightly back, it gave her face the look of marble sculpture, sharp, unyielding, remote. To her neighbors, she was above reproach, devout in her faith, always present at Sunday Mass, and a generous donor to church charities. But her true calling lay in a different kind of service. Guadalupe operated a domestic servant placement agency, a business, yes, but also a social ladder for poor rural girls seeking a better life in the capital. Dozens of families trusted her to house and train their daughters before placing them into employment with the city's elite. But behind her locked servant quarters behind the smile, she offered their mothers, Guadalupe, had devised what she chillingly referred to in her personal notes as El Método Especial, her special method. It was in reality a system of brutal psychological and physical torture. She saw herself not merely as a mistress of a house, but as a sculptor of obedience. Each girl who entered her care was subjected to increasingly cruel corrections designed to erase individuality, to create what she termed perfect domestic silence. Her son Aurelio lived upstairs like a ghost in his own home. At 22, he was fragile, pale, and trembled at sudden noise. He barely left his rooms. Those who saw him described a boy whose nerves had long ago frayed under the weight of unspeakable knowledge. He had learned early, perhaps too early, to make himself invisible. Whenever his mother's voice slipped into a low measured tone, whenever her eyes brightened in that particular way that preceded what she called her sessions, Aurelio disappeared into his room, into himself. He developed a stutter, a twitch in his left eye, and an increasing reliance on laudanum to dull his senses and, more importantly, to help him sleep through the night, sleep through the sounds. You see, Guadalupe's operation was grotesquely efficient. The girls she acquired came from Mexico's most desperate provinces. Poor families, barely literate sometimes, unable to travel back to the capital once their daughter was sent. The arrangement appeared charitable. In truth, it was the perfect system for a predator. No one questioned when a girl didn't stay long. No one demanded to see the servant once placed. And no one, absolutely no one, thought to challenge the word of Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano, the widow, the benefactor, the model of upper-class virtue. But that winter in 1892, the walls began to speak louder than her reputation could suppress. The girls who came to Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano's home arrived like leaves swept into an unknown city, weightless, unanchored, and silent. They had no papers, no family ties. Most couldn't read the contracts they signed, nor write letters home to tell their families if something went wrong. If they vanished, there was no one with the power or position to demand answers. And for years, that's exactly how Guadalupe wanted it. She was careful in the beginning. Her early experiments, a word she used in private journals, later recovered, were limited to what she termed disciplinas menores, minor corrections. Punishments she could dismiss as necessary refinements. A slap for misbehavior. A day without food for speaking out of turn. Public humiliation, isolation, verbal abuse, all veiled beneath a cloak of character building and moral instruction. But she kept records, notes, observations. She was testing thresholds. And then in January of 1887, something shifted. It was a cold morning. January 18th. The kind of morning where the mist hangs low to the ground and muffles sound, where even the bells from distant cathedrals seem dulled, like the city is holding its breath. A strange stillness hovered over Mexico City, a city built on the bones of a vanished lake, a city trying desperately to forget what it was built on. At the door of the mansion on Tuba Street stood a girl, Casimira Juarez, 16 years old, alone. She had walked or hitched rides on carts and supply wagons for 6 days from her village in the mountains of Michoacan. Everything she owned was tied into a small cloth bundle. Her parents had died the year before cholera. Her village priest, pitying the orphan girl, had written her a letter of recommendation and given her a name. Senora Bejarano, he'd said. A good Christian woman, a protector of girls. When Guadalupe opened the door, she scanned the girl like a ledger. Casimira was perfect, young, docile, grateful. That was the expression Guadalupe liked most, grateful. It meant they wouldn't run. Not yet. You've clearly been raised with proper values, Guadalupe said, with her clipped, commanding voice, examining the letter with exaggerated scrutiny. Good references are essential. My household maintains the highest standards. She turned and gestured for the girl to follow. Inside the house was hushed, all shadowed corridors, thick velvet curtains and marble floors that echoed like distant footsteps. Religious paintings adorned the walls, their saints gazing down in silence. Heavy furniture with clawed feet seemed to watch Casimira as she passed. The girl's room was small but cleaner than anything she'd ever known. A narrow bed, a basin of fresh water, a crucifix on the wall. Guadalupe smiled faintly. You'll find I treat my girls fairly, she said. But I require absolute obedience. The families I serve demand perfection. You must reflect that. At first, life in the mansion was not what Casimira had feared. It had order, warm food, purpose. She woke before dawn, prepared breakfast, swept the halls polished silver. She washed clothes and mended sheets. Her limbs ached, but it was better than starving. Guadalupe, she believed, was merely strict, a careful woman. Watching her closely, yes, but perhaps that was just her way. But what Casimira couldn't see, what she hadn't learned to fear yet, was that she wasn't being supervised. She was being studied, each movement, every hesitation. Guadalupe was cataloging her like a scientist documenting a specimen. How much she could lift, how much she could endure before she cried, what criticisms hurt her most, what praise made her blush. She was waiting. And then, ever so slowly, the air around Casimira began to change. The praises disappeared. Small faults were suddenly magnified. Guadalupe would examine a perfectly folded sheet and declare it sloppy. A spotless table now seemed greasy. Bread baked to perfection was declared too dry. Casimira, confused, began to apologize, profusely. She scrubbed harder. She refolded linens into the night. But the harder she worked, the more faults appeared. I'm beginning to think, Guadalupe said one evening, her tone colder than the marble beneath their feet, that you were not as well trained as your priest claimed. Casimira looked down, unsure how to respond. Perhaps her employer added softly, you need a more intensive education in proper behavior. Casimira shivered. She was still smiling. Guadalupe was still smiling. And if you're still with us listening, this is where I ask you to pause, not to stop, no, but to take a breath. Because this is the moment the story shifts. This is the point where observation becomes cruelty. And cruelty, left unchecked, becomes something even darker. There are parts of this tale that history has tried to forget, but we remember them here at Sleepy History Tales. Not to sensationalize, but to witness. To say that this happened, that someone noticed too late, and that silence is not the same as innocence. The punishments began, as they often do in such stories, with small humiliations. Just enough to seem like discipline, just subtle enough to be ignored. Casimira was made to stand motionless in the kitchen for hours. She was told it was penance for sloppiness, though she had done nothing wrong. When she stumbled from fatigue, she was called clumsy, and her meals were taken from her. When her hands cracked and bled from scrubbing the marble floors too long, she was scolded, not for working too hard, but for getting blood on the stone. And upstairs, her only witness watched from the shadows. Aurelio, her son, still breathing, still observing, still afraid. He had seen this before, but never this far, never this deliberate. When he finally summoned the courage to question his mother, to plead perhaps, or simply ask, Guadalupe turned on him with eyes like winter stone. "I see," she said softly, "that you've forgotten who maintains this household." Then a pause. Her voice dropped like ice water. "Perhaps you'd like to join Casimira in her lessons." Aurelio said nothing. He went back upstairs. He poured more laudanum into a glass already half full and drank until the edges of his mind blurred. He knew what was coming, and he knew he could not stop it. By February, the mask of discipline had dropped. There was no more pretending. Casimira's world had become a waking nightmare. Her days filled not with chores or training, but with agony crafted to break her soul before it broke her body. The mansion's basement, once meant for storage, had become a hidden theater of cruelty. Guadalupe called it her cuarto de disciplina, but in truth it was a chamber designed for one purpose: to experiment with human pain. Casimira was stripped of her clothes and left to stand in the cold stone room, trembling not just from cold, but from exposure, from the shame of being stared at, measured, judged like livestock at market. Guadalupe circled her, slowly pointing to ribs she herself had made visible through starvation. "Look what you've become," she whispered, her voice gentle and intimate, the kind of voice meant for lullabies. "This is what happens when girls forget their place." And then came the brazier. The same iron stove that warmed the mansion's rooms was repurposed. Guadalupe would heat metal tools until they glowed, not to use them immediately, but to hold them near the girl's skin, close enough that the heat would make her weep in anticipation, flinch, gasp, all before contact. The touch itself was brief, but precise. It was calculated to cause agony, not death, not yet. And afterward, Guadalupe would treat the wounds herself, applying salves with clinical precision. She'd studied anatomy with the obsession of a doctor, but her goal was not healing, it was repetition. A wound must heal just enough so it could be opened again. The physical torture was only half the design. She broke Casimira's mind methodically, forced her to confess to sins she'd never committed, made her thank her for punishments that pushed her toward madness, forced her to beg not for freedom but for correction, until the girl began to believe it. Until somehow suffering became the only truth she understood. And above it all, Aurelio listened. He tried to pretend the walls were thick enough. He tried to drown the sounds, but they always found him. In a hidden journal beneath his mattress, he began writing. Scrawled notes, fragments, something between a confession and a cry for help. February 15th. The screaming was worse last night. I tried to cover my ears, pillows, hands. Nothing helps. She says it's for the girl's moral improvement. But her eyes when she says that, God help me. I think she enjoys it. February 23rd. Found blood on the cellar stairs. Asked about it. She smiled. Said it was an accident. Cooking lessons, she said. What kind of lesson needs that much blood? February 28th. Haven't seen Casimira upstairs in days. Mother says she's sick. But the sounds, I can't write what they sound like. And then finally it ended. In the first days of March, after 6 long weeks of unimaginable torment, Casimira's heart simply stopped. It didn't burst. It didn't fail spectacularly. It just surrendered. Quietly. Guadalupe had planned it as another session routine, if such a word could apply to what she did. But the girl's body gave out before the ritual could complete. For a moment, Guadalupe stood still looking at her victim. Then came something unexpected: satisfaction and disappointment. The act itself had brought her more pleasure than anything else in her life. But now it was over. The silence felt anticlimactic, inconvenient even. There was a body to dispose of, and quickly. With cold efficiency, she wrapped Casimira's remains in old bed sheets. She waited until the deepest part of night, when even the constables dozed and the horses in the street stopped shifting. She loaded the bundle onto a cart and set off. The city's outer districts were still wild in 1887. Vacant lots stretched along the edge of expansion earth that was soft private and ready to swallow what polite society could not. She buried the girl in a shallow grave. No prayers, no headstone, only dirt. And as she smoothed the final mound of earth, she made a decision. One that would define the rest of her life. Casimira had not been a mistake. She had been a revelation. Something had awakened inside Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano. Something dark, ravenous, and impossibly calm. Casimira's death hadn't shaken her. It had refined her. This wasn't guilt. It was clarity. The thrill she discovered in domination, the power of total control over body and mind, had settled inside her like a second heart, one that beat louder in the quiet hours of the night. She had fed it once. Now it demanded more. But she would be smarter this time, more methodical, more professional. Following Casimira's murder, Guadalupe entered what she came to think of chillingly as her professional phase. The mistakes of that first experiment had nearly exposed her, and she would not risk discovery again. The key, she realized, wasn't cruelty. It was control. So for nearly a year, she buried herself in the roles the city expected her to play. By day, she was tireless. She chaired charity events for the cathedral, smiled graciously at fundraisers, and expanded her domestic placement service, all while subtly reinforcing her image as a pillar of moral virtue. A devout widow, a businesswoman with high standards, a guardian of Mexico City's daughters. But at night, her true self sharpened in silence. She studied, mapped social patterns, researched methods of restraint more elegant and efficient than her earlier improvisations. She read obscure medical texts, anatomical guides, even translations of French judicial practices regarding interrogation and punishment. And above all, she planned. She also turned her calculating attention to Aurelio, who had grown increasingly unstable since Casimira's death. Her son had become weepy, erratic. He mumbled during meals. spoke to corners of rooms, wrote nonsense in the margins of newspapers. He was too close to the truth and too weak to carry it. So Guadalupe took steps. She arranged for him to be seen by a visiting German physician who specialized in nervous disorders. The man diagnosed Aurelio with melancholic dementia, a convenient label that made anything he said suspect the ravings of a mind unwell. If Aurelio ever tried to tell someone what was happening inside the mansion, his words would slide off society like water off wax. And then in September of 1888, Guadalupe found her next subject. Maria Santos, a widowed farm wife displaced by drought and debt, appeared at the mansion gate with her 15-year-old daughter Elena. The family had come to Mexico City with the last of their savings, hoping for work. Any work. Maria was exhausted, sun-worn, desperate. Guadalupe welcomed them with warmth and sympathy. She assured the mother that her daughter would be trained, protected, educated in the ways of the city. Maria wept with gratitude. She kissed Guadalupe's hand, and just like that, Elena Santos stepped into the mansion on Tuba Street and into the hands of someone who had prepared for her with the precision of a hunter laying traps. Elena was perfect, young, isolated, and most dangerous of all, resilient. Guadalupe noticed it immediately. The steady way Elena held her gaze, the quiet strength in her posture. Breaking someone like that was more gratifying than crushing the already broken. So she proceeded, slowly, subtly. At first, the house seemed almost welcoming. A firm but fair employer, a simple routine, clear expectations, and Guadalupe, always observant, made sure her corrections were mild at first. Nothing violent, nothing obvious. Instead, it was doubt she introduced. "I notice more mistakes lately," Guadalupe said one afternoon, her tone calm. "Perhaps the city air doesn't suit you." A pause. "Some girls from the provinces just never adjust." Elena would protest gently, always respectfully, that she was doing her best. Guadalupe would nod, and then quietly remind her that effort was not the same as results. The house became a place of invisible standards and constant tension. Elena began second-guessing herself. Was that cloth truly clean? Did the water boil long enough? Was her tone disrespectful? That confusion, the erosion of certainty, was intentional. Once the mind cracks, the body follows. Punishments began, but always as teachable moments. A mist spot of dust led to hours of forced stillness. A dish served lukewarm meant dinner withheld. A raised eyebrow, or perhaps just imagined defiance, earned a night locked in the coal cellar shivering in total darkness. But Guadalupe had learned the rhythm now. She allowed time between each escalation, days, sometimes weeks, enough time for Elena to adapt, to lower her guard. And just as she adjusted, a new cruelty arrived. The girl didn't realize what was happening until resistance no longer seemed possible or rational. And upstairs, Aurelio watched it all unfold again. But this time, he tried to stop it. He confronted his mother gently at first. "She looks frightened," he said one morning. "Maybe she's ill. Maybe the work is too much." Guadalupe smiled. That cold, practiced smile. "I see you're concerned about Elena's training," she said softly. "That shows you have a kind heart." Then she leaned closer. But kindness without wisdom can be very cruel. And with that, she dismissed him not with anger, but with surgical control. The kind that makes any protest feel foolish. Aurelio stepped back into silence, back into the opium haze, back into the nightmare. And downstairs, Elena's descent continued one step at a time. These country girls, Guadalupe once said to her son, need firm guidance to overcome their natural laziness and deceit. She sipped her coffee as she said it, as if discussing housework. Then she smiled. Would you rather I send her back to the streets? A pause. She'd fall into sin before the week's end. Is that what you want? Aurelio stood frozen. He had argued before quietly, timidly, but this time he pushed harder. Elena, he said, was terrified. She flinched at shadows. Something was wrong. Anyone could see it. Guadalupe's eyes darkened. Of course, she said, with a tone that wrapped poison in velvet, if you feel you understand domestic management better than I do, you're welcome to take over the girl's moral development yourself. The meaning wasn't subtle. Aurelio had seen enough, heard enough to know what that meant. To challenge her authority was to risk replacing her victim. And so, like so many others before him, he withdrew back to his room, back to his opium, back to the pages of a journal he no longer expected anyone to read. By December of 1888, Elena Santos was no longer the girl who had walked nervously through the gates that autumn morning. The healthy farm girl had become a husk, a pale, silent shadow who obeyed every command with machine-like precision. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She didn't eat unless told to. She moved through the mansion like a ghost already half gone. Guadalupe, meanwhile, was thriving. Her methods had evolved. Casimira's death had taught her not only what was possible, but how to refine it. She had perfected a rhythm-stress cruelty, withdrawal-reward. Her tools had improved, her techniques more precise. The pain was no longer chaos. It was choreography. The basement had been transformed. Chains now hung from iron beams, their blackened links smoothed by hands that had fought too long and too often. The brazier glowed in its corner, a steady orange eye surrounded by metal implements, darkened by fire and repetition. And then there was the chair. To any outsider, it might have looked like a medical contraption, something designed to cradle the weak. But Guadalupe had commissioned it from a blacksmith under false pretenses. It was not built for healing. It was built for access. Every limb restrained, every joint exposed, every inch reachable. Elena's final ordeal lasted 3 days. It was a production. That's how Guadalupe viewed it. A performance with acts and intermissions, peaks and valleys. Pain was followed by false tenderness. Brutality gave way to whispered forgiveness. The unpredictability, she believed, deepened. The effect made resistance impossible. You see, my dear, Guadalupe said during one of these false intervals, gently applying salve to burns she herself had inflicted only hours before, this is all for your own good. She cupped the girl's face. Every soul must be purified before it can enter heaven. And some souls, she added almost reverently, require more purification than others. This religious justification was new and deeply disturbing. Somewhere in her descent, Guadalupe had twisted theology into self-permission. In her eyes, she wasn't evil. She was necessary, a vessel, a purifier. She believed truly that she was saving these girls. When Elena died, her heart giving out unexpectedly, during what Guadalupe had planned as the final movement, the killer didn't weep. She clenched her fists not in grief, but in frustration. The sequence had been so carefully constructed, the climax so meticulously designed. Now it had ended too early. It wasn't failure, but it wasn't perfect either. Still, she had learned something about pacing, about thresholds. Her next subject, she decided, would benefit from this experience. And the process would be, in her words, correspondingly more fulfilling. Elena's burial followed the pattern established with Casimira, but this time, Guadalupe added safeguards. She had identified multiple disposal sites, now vacant lots, abandoned drainage gullies, neglected gardens along the city's expanding edges. She varied the days, the times, the directions she traveled, no pattern, no trail. But even perfection has its blind spots. 3 weeks later, Maria Santos, Elena's mother, arrived at the mansion. Her hands trembled, her voice cracked. She had heard nothing from her daughter since Christmas. No letters, no visitors, not even word from neighbors. Guadalupe, as always, was prepared. She opened the door with a look of practiced concern and motioned the woman inside. "I've been meaning to write," she began, voice low and sorrowful. "I'm afraid Elena became quite ill not long after Christmas. A fever. It affected her mind, I think, as well as her body." Maria's eyes widened. "She was very worried about you," Guadalupe continued. "Kept saying she had to return, that you were in danger. I tried to convince her to wait to rest, but you know how stubborn young people can be." She reached out, placing a comforting hand over Maria's. "I wish I had stopped her, but she was so insistent. I thought perhaps she knew something I didn't." The lie slid from her lips like silk, and Maria, worn down by worry and hunger and grief, believed her. After all, what kind of devout widow respected by the church would lie about something so terrible? The lie Guadalupe told Maria Santos was simple, warm, and devastatingly effective. It was exactly what a mother needed to hear, enough to soothe the ache, yet vague enough to close every door behind her. Maria left the mansion, believing Elena was somewhere out there, walking roads lined with danger, trying to return to her. She would never know that her daughter's body lay still, bones whitening in a shallow grave just beyond the city's edge, already returning to the earth. For Guadalupe, this marked a turning point. The years that followed between the end of 1888 and the spring of 1892 became the apex of her depravity. But unlike before, it no longer looked like madness. It looked like success. She had learned to control her impulses, to bottle the hunger until the timing was perfect. Each act of violence became not an accident or an urge, but a plan. Her mask grew flawless. She became a fixture of Mexico City's charitable scene. She organized relief for earthquake victims, funded orphanages, donated so generously to the church that the Archbishop himself praised her name from the pulpit. And the more she was celebrated, the more untouchable she became. No one suspects a saint. No one dares accuse one. Meanwhile, her domestic placement agency blossomed into a well-oiled machine, one that filtered Mexico's rural desperation through her doorstep. She was the name among the capital's elite. If you wanted a properly trained servant, one raised in virtue and obedience, you went to Senora Bejarano. Her reputation was sterling, but beneath that sterling name was a system, a screening process. She looked for girls with no local family, no education, no means of escape. Girls with eyes still bright, not yet dimmed by hardship. And most of all, girls whose inner strength would make the eventual collapse all the more exquisite. By now, even her son Aurelio had ceased to matter. His condition, once a liability, had become a shield. Confined mostly to his rooms, Aurelio drifted between opium-induced dreams and half-muttered memories. When he did appear in public, his shaking hands and vacant gaze only reinforced what Guadalupe had orchestrated, the narrative that he was simply born wrong, that his fragility was genetic, not environmental. She commissioned expensive specialists, hosted doctors, read aloud his medical notes at church teas. "I do all I can," she'd sigh. But behind closed doors, she ensured his mind remained just broken enough to be discredited, but just intact enough to witness. And then came the spring of 1892. Guadalupe was ready. 2 deaths had taught her how to break an individual. Now she would attempt something new, multiple captives at once. More variables, more psychology, more music in the cruelty. The opportunity arrived in the form of the Vega sisters. Esperanza Vega was 19 tall and grave-eyed, the kind of quiet dignity Guadalupe found irresistible. Her family had lost everything, crops, land, even their father, to war and drought in Hidalgo. She had come to Mexico City with her 2 younger sisters, Carmen and Rosa, hoping to keep them alive. Carmen, 17, was shy, nervous, and skittish. Rosa, just 15, was clever, too clever, and quick to observe, quick to question. Guadalupe smiled as she interviewed them. "I can certainly use all 3 of you," she said, her voice low and maternal. "In fact, it would be ideal to have sisters working together. You'll help one another adjust. That kind of loyalty is very important in my household." The girls looked at one another, uncertain but hopeful. What they didn't know was that Guadalupe had been preparing for exactly this. She had spent months drafting new techniques, ways to turn family bonds into weapons. What if the girls were forced to betray each other, to watch one suffer as punishment for another's failure? Pain was one thing, but guilt. Guilt echoed deeper. Sound 3. Soft heartbeats slowly falling out of sync. Just when you think you've heard the worst, it gets worse. What Guadalupe Bejarano was planning would stretch even our understanding of cruelty and expose just how much evil can thrive when wrapped in lace, lit by candlelight, and praised from the pulpit. If this story is giving you chills, share it. Tell someone who doesn't know how dark the past can be. Tap that like button if you dare, and subscribe to Sleepy History Tales, where the monsters don't just hide under beds. Sometimes they sit in pews. We're not done, because Guadalupe, she's just getting started. The arrival of the Vega sisters marked the beginning of Guadalupe Bejarano's most complex and most chilling chapter. By 1892, she was no longer experimenting. She was composing, no longer rushing toward violence like a storm. She had learned true satisfaction didn't lie in the chaos of sudden brutality. It lay in cultivated despair, in erosion, not explosion. In months of silence before the scream, For the first 4 weeks, the Vega sisters lived a life that by their standards seemed almost luxurious. They ate well. They worked regular hours. Guadalupe even gave them short afternoons of permission to walk the nearby avenues, gaze at the cathedral spires, or simply breathe a moment of freedom. And that was the point. That breathing room, it made what came next feel like suffocation. Guadalupe had become a master of emotional manipulation. And the first phase always was comfort. Because people don't break easily when they're frightened, but they shatter when their hope is stolen, piece by piece. So she made them believe they were safe. Then little by little, she began turning them against each other. It started with compliments. "I've noticed Rosa adapts better than the others," she told Esperanza over tea. "Some girls are simply born with refinement. Carmen, on the other hand, may require closer instruction. They were just words. But words placed correctly become knives." She introduced competition. Only one girl could earn the nicer uniform. Only one got praise. Only one would be trusted. The same tasks graded unfairly. The same errors punished inconsistently. The same kindness distributed just off-center enough to stir resentment. By the summer of 1892, the sisters shared the same room but no longer trusted each other. They whispered less, slept facing different walls, each wondering, am I the failure? Or is she just better than me? And then came the room. That basement, the place where Elena Santos had died, was no longer just a chamber. Guadalupe had renovated it like an artist returning to her canvas. Everything was more precise now. There were 3 restraint chairs, each one perfectly positioned, so that every girl could watch her sisters suffer. Chains now hung from the beams like twisted jewelry. The floor had been redone for easier cleaning, and in one corner, a locked cabinet of tools, surgical, electrical, thermal. She had redesigned the space not just for torture, but for spectacle. This wasn't discipline, it was theater. The first time the sisters were taken down, Guadalupe wore her softest expression. "I've designed a special training program," she said, with the warm composure of a governess. "There are some lessons that require immersion. This room is where we practice the deeper disciplines of obedience." She fastened their restraints herself. Not tightly, not at first. She let them feel the helplessness before she hurt them. Gave them just enough mobility to squirm. Just enough illusion to think they might escape before removing that illusion entirely. She moved around them slowly, her heels echoing like a metronome. "The most important quality in a servant," she said, "is absolute obedience. But obedience requires understanding. And understanding, girls, sometimes grows from discomfort." She demonstrated with clinical calm. A heated iron pressed gently, but long enough against Carmen's shoulder. A cloth soaked in water and forced over Rosa's face enough to trigger panic, but not death. A short burst of current through Esperanza's ankle from a hand-cranked battery, a gift from a doctor who had long since lost his license. And all the while, Guadalupe spoke. Not with rage, not even with cruelty, but with patience. "You see, Carmen, your resistance only makes it worse for everyone," she murmured, tightening a strap. "And Rosa, when you hesitate, your sister suffers. Maybe you'd like to help her cooperate." This was her innovation. Not just pain, but witnessed pain. Not just punishment, but shared guilt. By dividing their minds, she could break their bodies more easily. The technique worked, that cold brilliance of cruelty, forcing victims to watch, to negotiate each other's pain, was far more effective than even Guadalupe Bejarano had anticipated. Within weeks, the Vega sisters were no longer sisters in any meaningful sense. They still shared blood, but not trust, not comfort, not protection. Each girl had become an island, isolated in terror, clinging to any small favor, even if it meant offering up her sibling for deeper torment. And Guadalupe, she thrived on it. Esperanza, the eldest, bore a special torment, one Guadalupe sharpened with exquisite precision. "You brought them here," she would whisper gently into her ear during long hours in the basement. "You were their protector, their guide. And now, look." And then, the offer. "So easy to end this," she murmured, brushing hair from the girl's face with a false tenderness. "All you have to do is ask me to transfer their punishments to you. I know they'd be grateful. Such a devoted sister." It wasn't a trick. Guadalupe would honor the request for a while. But then came the reversal. "Rosa's been far too quiet lately," she'd say. 2 days later. "And Carmen? Well, she's been watching. Don't you think they should carry a little of your burden too? You wouldn't want them to feel left out of this salvation, would you?" No matter what Esperanza did, she failed. Every gesture of protection became a blade turned inward. Every sacrifice opened new doors for Guadalupe's cruelty. By the end of 1892, the energy it took to manage 3 captives and the elaborate psychological labyrinth she'd created began to unravel even Guadalupe's control. She was stretched thin, sloppy, her public poise frayed at the edges. Aurelio, sedated and trembling through most days, began to notice things, disturbing things. His mother no longer spoke to people. She spoke near them, murmuring to the air about methods and refinements, carrying on half conversations with people who weren't in the room. She forgot to eat. She forgot to rest. She forgot sometimes to pretend. Her cheeks hollowed. Her eyes glowed with a fevered light. And worst of all, she began inviting him to watch. "I think it's time," she said one night in December. "You're old enough now to understand what I've been doing. It's part of your education, real education. You can't learn about human nature without seeing it tested." Aurelio pretended to be ill, upped his dosage, stayed locked in his rooms, but he could feel her patience waning. There was a new tone in her voice when she summoned him, a tone that said, "Refuse again and you might be the next lesson." That fear, more than courage, drove him to action. For the first time in his life, Aurelio Bejarano began to fight back. Not with confrontation, but with pen and paper. During rare windows of lucidity, he began writing. At first, scattered thoughts, memories, murmurs. But then he became methodical, naming dates, describing voices, marking stains, tracing absences, a secret ledger of horror. December 15th, 1892. 3 voices screaming, not 2. She told me she had only taken on 2 new girls. She's lying. December 20th, 1892. Found bloodied clothing in her wardrobe. Said it was for medical training. But what kind of training requires that much blood? December 28th, 1892. She asked again if I'd join her in the basement. This time, she didn't smile. She said, "It's time you understood what being a man means." I think she means to involve me. Aurelio wrote as if his life depended on it. Because it did. Then, the slip. New Year's Day, 1893. A quiet knock at the door. A parish priest routine, visit a blessing for the home as he had done for years. But Guadalupe forgot. She had been awake for 3 days. She hadn't changed her dress in 2. Her hands, raw from chemical exposure, were shaking. Her eyes wild. Her shoes mismatched. And the priest noticed. He noticed the sharp scent beneath the incense iron vinegar rot. He noticed the scratches on her wrist and the bruises just barely covered by lace. And he noticed most of all the sound, a single scream, muffled far below, like someone trying not to be heard, but failing. Guadalupe smiled. "The pipes," she said quickly, "always groaning in winter." But her voice trembled, and the priest hesitated. In that moment, a moment so small it might have passed in any other household, the mask of Guadalupe Bejarano began to slip. And from beneath it, something far older and darker began to emerge. If you're still with us, dear listener, breathe. Because what comes next will take that breath away. It was supposed to be a routine visit. Father Miguel Herrera had come bearing nothing more than an envelope, Guadalupe Bejarano's annual charitable donation receipt, and a polite inquiry about Lenten plans for the cathedral. But his knock at the door on that cold January afternoon of 1893 collided with something far more sinister. Unbeknownst to him, Guadalupe was deep in one of her basement sessions, extended, fevered, and unhinged. By the time she stumbled upstairs, face flushed, hair slightly askew, she was already too late to mask the sounds. Even through the thick walls of the mansion, they leaked out soft at first, but unmistakable. Muffled wails, rhythmic banging. A woman's voice, hoarse from screaming. Father Herrera looked up sharply. "Senora Bejarano," he asked gently but with concern, "is someone ill in your household?" That didn't sound like fever dreams. Guadalupe forced a smile. "Yes, Father. A new girl. Poor thing, terribly sick. It's a fever that's reached her mind, I'm afraid. I've called for assistance." The priest nodded. But he didn't believe her. For years, he had admired this widow, her generosity, her polish, her reputation for Christian service. But today, something felt off. Her voice trembled, her hands twitched, and more than anything, she was desperate to end their conversation, so desperate in fact, that she cut short their traditional tea. Father Herrera left the house with the envelope still tucked in his coat. But outside, he did not return to the cathedral. He turned down the narrow street and began asking questions, quietly, among parishioners, neighbors, shopkeepers, the kinds of people Guadalupe never thought to fear. What he learned chilled him to the bone. Multiple neighbors, when asked gently, admitted that the sounds from the Bejarano household had changed in recent months. They had always accepted strict discipline. Many wealthy homes were not kind to their servants. But now the noises weren't stern commands or isolated scoldings. They were screams. Sometimes they lasted hours. And there were other signs, strange smells like burnt hair or singed flesh drifting from upper windows. Doors opening at night. no lights visible inside. Then came the testimony of tradesmen. A blacksmith, reluctant but honest, admitted that months ago he had built custom restraints at Guadalupe's request. Heavy, complex, reinforced. She had claimed they were for managing wayward girls. But something about the request had lingered uneasily with him. A physician reported selling her medical instruments not used in any ordinary sick room. He had assumed she was providing them to a hospital. When pressed, he admitted she had purchased sedatives in bulk and oddly never asked for instructions. Most damning of all was the testimony of grocers and butchers. Guadalupe still spoke as if she employed half a dozen young women. But her food orders had dropped sharply in the past year. Too little by far for a household of that size, and no one had seen the girls she claimed to be sheltering. As winter deepened, the mansion itself seemed to darken with it. Inside, Guadalupe Bejarano descended into the coldest, cruelest stage of her depravity. The torture of the Vega sisters had now entered its 7th month. Their bodies and minds were collapsing. Esperanza, once the protector, the decision-maker, the eldest, now existed in a dreamlike fugue. Most days she didn't speak, but when touched, when punished, she erupted into shaking, hysterical screaming. Her body was a map of pain. Raised scars in decorative patterns, burns applied with aesthetic precision. Wounds opened and reopened until infection made her skin smell faintly sweet. Carmen responded differently. She was lost in a private universe now, laughing at things no one said, speaking to people who weren't there, singing lullabies while being tortured. Guadalupe found her fascinating. She considered Carmen a puzzle, how to break a mind already cracked open. And Rosa still knew, still watched, still calculated, still begged, which made her agony all the more delicious to Guadalupe and all the more horrifying to witness. Rosa tried everything, bargaining, praying, offering herself in exchange for her sister's release. Guadalupe listened, nodded, promised, then broke those promises. Rosa's desperation became just another spice in the slow-roasting stew of human misery. But even Guadalupe, as addicted as she was to her rituals of pain, understood that this was ending. The sisters were dying. Slowly, yes, but inevitably. Their bodies could no longer withstand the cycles of injury and hunger. Their minds were unraveling into threads, and Guadalupe, who now required increasingly complex suffering to satisfy her urges, felt the old hunger, building again. But this time, she didn't wait. She made the decision. She would begin preparing for new victims even before the Vega sisters were dead. This time, there would be no long delay between conquests. No dormant phase. She would stagger their arrival, maintain a supply, keep the cycle continuous. It would be the final refinement of her design, a perpetual machine of cruelty. She believed it was brilliant. What she did not know was that her machine was already rusting, and someone was listening. In the final weeks of her reign of horror, Guadalupe Bejarano made her last and fatal miscalculation. Her new obsession had just arrived in the city. Julia Mendez, a weary widow from Querétaro, had come to Mexico City with her 14-year-old daughter Isabella, desperate for work after losing their land to creditors. They were quiet, polite, and unprotected. Guadalupe didn't hesitate. She saw Isabella as the perfect next subject, isolated, obedient, still young enough to mold and destroy. But there was one problem. 3 bodies still occupied the basement chairs, and Guadalupe, growing impatient, decided she could no longer wait for the Vega sisters to die naturally. She would accelerate their deaths, clear the space, and begin fresh with Isabella. In her eagerness, she failed to notice that something else had shifted, not in her house, but in her son. Aurelio had spent years trapped in a fog of laudanum and fear, scribbling confessions into notebooks that no one read, praying for a day that might never come. But as his mother's madness deepened, as her whispers grew louder and her cruelty more casual, something inside him began to awaken. And on February 14th, 1893, he acted. For weeks, Aurelio had been corresponding in secret with Father Miguel Herrera, the same priest whose visit had first cracked the illusion of innocence. At first, the priest had been horrified, then overwhelmed, then determined. Aurelio gave him everything, pages upon pages of journal entries, complete with dates, descriptions, names, burial sites. He sketched the layout of the torture chamber. He listed the herbs and sedatives Guadalupe used. He documented how she staged disappearances. And most damning of all, he explained her mind, how she believed the pain she caused was not evil, but holy. Father Herrera knew this evidence was explosive. But even now, bringing a case against Senora Bejarano, the city's darling of charity friend to Bishop's benefactor of orphanages, would be dangerous. Without direct evidence, everything could collapse. And so, Aurelio made a decision. He would open the door. That Valentine's night, as his mother prepared what she called the Vega sisters' final instruction, Aurelio unlocked the mansion's rear entrance and waited in the shadows for the authorities to arrive. Just before midnight, a small group of civil investigators, accompanied by Father Herrera, stepped across the threshold. Guided by Aurelio's trembling hand, they descended the narrow staircase toward the basement. What they found would never leave them. Sound footsteps on stone, then a low gasp, then vomiting. The torture chamber had not been designed for secrecy. It had been designed for efficiency, for performance. And what they walked into was a nightmare curated over years. 3 chairs, 3 girls, 3 shattered lives. Esperanza was unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular. Her skin bore the layered scars of deliberate patterning. Symmetrical burns, repeated incisions, signs of brutal internal trauma. Carmen was technically awake but lost somewhere beyond reach, rocking slightly, smiling at the ceiling, her eyes dull with madness. And Rosa saw them. She looked straight at the men as they entered her face, sunken, her mouth trembling. She tried to speak, but what came out were not words, only whispers. Please, not for rescue, but for death. The men froze, some vomited, others wept. One officer, a father himself, had to be pulled back as he raised his pistol, eyes locked on the woman responsible. But Guadalupe Bejarano only smiled. She was standing beside one of the chairs, clad not in her usual mourning attire, but in a black gown with silver trim, almost ceremonial. Her hands held instruments still warm from use. Her face bore no fear, no confusion, only the faint irritation of a host whose dinner party has been interrupted. "Gentlemen," she said with calm dignity, I assume you have proper authorization for this intrusion into my private household affairs?" They did not answer. They didn't need to. What she said next chilled the room. "You'll find everything is in order. These girls are undergoing moral instruction. Their souls were in danger, you see. I've only ever wanted to help." She gestured toward Rosa, whose shoulder was still bleeding. "It's not cruelty," Guadalupe insisted. "It's purification. Pain is a form of truth. You wouldn't understand. You haven't studied." To the investigators, it was clear. This woman was not simply a sadist. She was something more dangerous, a true believer. In her mind, she was not a criminal. She was a priestess chosen to cleanse the weak through fire and fear. They arrested her without resistance. She went quietly, her expression calm, even faintly bemused. Only when they tried to separate her from her instruments did she scream. Sound screeching iron. A woman's voice, howling in rage, fading into silence. Back in the basement, medics began working furiously to stabilize the survivors. Esperanza would remain unconscious for 3 days. When she awoke, she spoke only one sentence before falling back into silence. "Is it over?" Carmen would never speak again. Rosa, broken but still lucid, would eventually testify in court. And Aurelio, he was not arrested. He was not praised. He simply disappeared. Some say the guilt drove him into exile. Others believe the church sheltered him quietly. But in the years to follow, no record of his name would surface again in Mexico City. What happened to Guadalupe Bejarano? Next, her trial and her fate would become the center of public obsession. But for now, in that cold February night, all anyone could feel was the weight of what they'd seen. 3 girls, 1 son, dozens of victims never found, and a monster who never thought she'd been doing anything wrong. Sound church bell. Then the closing whisper. History remembers the crimes, but it's the quiet survivors who carry them longest. The days following Guadalupe Bejarano's arrest were unlike anything Mexico had ever witnessed. What the investigators found beneath her mansion didn't just confirm Aurelio's testimony, it expanded it into something far darker. Inside that basement chamber, authorities uncovered a library of cruelty leather-bound ledgers filled with drawings and handwritten observations. Not frantic scribbles, but neatly organized records as if cataloging experiments. She had kept notes, precise entries dated and indexed detailing not only the methods she used, but their psychological impact on each individual victim. October 15th, 1892. The eldest sister's resistance continues to provide excellent opportunities for demonstrating consequences to the younger ones. Pain shared among family members seems to multiply exponentially rather than merely adding together. This technique should be refined further. November 3rd, 1892. Discovered that the middle sister's psychological withdrawal can be temporarily reversed through specific applications of threat to her siblings. The human capacity for protective instinct appears to override even severe mental damage under proper conditions. December 12, 1892. Beginning to plan final phases for current subjects. Their deterioration has reached the point where continued experimentation yields diminishing returns. New acquisitions will be necessary soon. This was not temporary madness. It was not impulse. This was method. They found scalpels modified for prolonged use, implements designed for precise restraint of joints and pressure points, dozens of household items re-engineered for pain, and a collection of personal objects, ribbons, brooches, hair combs taken from each victim and stored in a velvet-lined drawer like trophies. Even those who had tried to give Guadalupe the benefit of the doubt, who clung to the illusion that perhaps grief or trauma or some outside influence had twisted her mind, were forced into silence. The truth was unambiguous. Guadalupe Bejarano had planned everything, and now the nation had to face that truth. Her arrest on February 15, 1893 consumed the headlines. Mexico City had never seen a case like this, a female serial killer operating not in secrecy, but in plain sight, protected by wealth, piety, and reputation. She had given generously to the church. She had been lauded by bishops. She had hosted ministers in her home. She had smiled in public. And now, the same hands that served communion wine had to carry the bodies she left behind. Public reaction was not disbelief, it was denial. There were protests outside the courthouse demanding her release. Letters to the editor insisting it was a smear campaign by political rivals. A conspiracy by jealous neighbors. Anything but the truth. But then came the journals, and the silence followed. The preliminary hearings began within a week. Spectators filled the courtroom not because they sought justice, but because they couldn't comprehend what kind of mind could do the things they'd heard. When Guadalupe entered the chamber, she didn't flinch. She wore black as always, her hair tightly pinned, her expression one of calm composure. Not once did she look at the Vega sisters seated under heavy guard. Not once did she ask if Aurelio had come. She only looked forward as if bored. When asked about the torture chamber, she gave a gentle nod. Yes, she said, I built it. Every detail was chosen for its instructional value. When questioned about the Vega sisters' injuries, she frowned slightly. Not in regret, but in irritation. These girls came to me as ignorant peasants. If you had seen the condition of their manners, their posture, their understanding of scripture, you would understand that strict instruction was necessary. And when asked if she understood that what she had done constituted criminal acts, Guadalupe only tilted her head. I improved them, she said quietly. The pain was unfortunate, but transformation always comes at a price. It was this cold detachment that horrified observers most. Not rage, not wild mania, but conviction. She had no doubt in her own righteousness. The Vega sisters' testimony, when it came, was brief. Rosa, still weak, whispered her account through tears. Carmen, barely coherent, was led out of the room after several minutes of shaking and muttering. Esperanza, the oldest, stared blankly at the floor. Her statement was delivered by a doctor who read from her medical record, subject exhibits signs of complex trauma, including partial paralysis, night terrors, and identity confusion. Recovery prognosis poor. Guadalupe's defense, if it could be called that, was equally unsettling. Her attorneys argued that their client was not insane but inspired, that she believed deeply in what she did, that her methods, though harsh, were rooted in a desire to reform the broken, that others had misunderstood her vision. It was a defense that only made her seem more monstrous. The court took just 2 days to decide. Guilty on all counts. What followed was a legal debate that would echo across Mexico for years. Was Guadalupe Martinez de Bejarano sane enough to be executed? Or was she so profoundly detached from reality that death would serve no purpose? Psychiatrists disagreed. Religious authorities condemned her as a heretic. Civil leaders called her a danger to public trust. And the survivors quietly asked that she be forgotten. Eventually, the decision was made. Guadalupe would not hang. She would be confined to the San Tomas Asylum for the criminally insane indefinitely. When she was escorted to her cell in June 1893, she was still calm. She asked only one question: will there be students? She would die there, alone, unrepentant. But that's not where the story ends. Because for every journal she kept, for every instrument she designed, there remained the voices of those she tried to silence. Esperanza would never speak again. Carmen died within a year, but Rosa, the youngest, survived. And years later, in a trembling voice, she would tell one final detail no one had known: that during their worst nights, the girls would whisper to each other, not prayers, but their own names over and over just to remember who they were. Because in that house, the most dangerous thing wasn't pain. It was forgetting. Sound a candle being extinguished. We remember the killer. But we should also remember the ones who refused to vanish. Even when everything tried to erase them, the prosecution spared no detail. Led by one of Mexico's most formidable criminal attorneys, they constructed a case that was both methodical and deeply unsettling. Not only documenting the torture and near murder of the Vega sisters, but finally shedding light on the long-buried fates of Casimira Juarez and Elena Santos. The burial sites, mapped out with uncanny accuracy by Aurelio's journal, provided grisly physical evidence that matched precisely with entries in his mother's own hand. Expert after expert took the stand. Forensic physicians detailed the design and use of instruments found in Guadalupe's basement, noting that many had been modified in ways that revealed both anatomical knowledge and long-term planning. One testified that the devices were designed not to kill, but to preserve pain. But perhaps the most damning voices were not doctors or jurists. They were priests. Church officials already investigating persistent rumors surrounding the Bejarano household finally spoke. And what they said caused a visible shudder through the courtroom: that Guadalupe's secrets were never truly secret. That many had suspected but chosen silence over confrontation. Because Guadalupe had been powerful, generous, and very, very respected. As the trial captured headlines, it also captured the eye of Jose Guadalupe Posada, Mexico's most celebrated popular illustrator. Posada had spent his career unmasking the quiet horrors of society. And when he heard of the Bejarano case, he understood immediately what it represented. He did not depict Guadalupe as a monster. He showed her exactly as the world had always seen her, dressed in fine silk hair, pinned perfectly. Fingers delicately grasping the very tools she used to destroy lives. Behind her, the victims. Around her, the chamber. But the horror was not in blood. It was in the elegance. The engravings were printed in newspapers and broadsheets across the country. Some were banned. Others were passed hand to hand in secret. All of them made clear one terrible truth: that evil does not always look evil. Sometimes it curtsies. Sometimes it donates to churches. Sometimes it wears pearls. Guadalupe's verdict arrived in September of 1893. The charges were devastating in scope: multiple counts of aggravated torture, confirmed murders, criminal conspiracy, and psychological abuse. But the sentence left many shaken. She was found guilty. Yes, but she was sentenced to 10 years and 8 months. Not death, not life. Why? Because Mexico's justice system had no precedent for what she had done. There were no statutes for serial killers. And perhaps most importantly, society still struggled with the idea that a woman, a lady, could be capable of such monstrousness. Aurelio, despite providing key testimony, was not spared judgment. He was sentenced to 2 years for complicity. The court acknowledged his fear, the drug-induced paralysis, the psychological domination, but held him accountable for the years he remained silent. In truth, his punishment may have been more symbolic than punitive, but it was also a sign that silence has consequences even when born from terror. The Vega sisters suffered far worse fates. Esperanza, whose body had withstood months of methodical damage, died within weeks of her rescue. She never regained full consciousness. Carmen and Rosa survived physically, but they were never well again. Both would require long-term care. Carmen often silent, Rosa prone to panic and night terrors. Their names would vanish from public record, shielded by those who sought to preserve some fragment of dignity in the wake of unthinkable suffering. Guadalupe Bejarano was sent to La Cárcel de Belén, Mexico's most infamous prison. There she was not treated as a curiosity, but as something to be feared. Even among thieves and murderers, her name carried weight, not in awe, but in revulsion. Inmates refused to speak to her. Some guards refused to be alone with her. And so, she was placed in permanent solitary confinement, alone, but she wasn't idle. Reports from her cell described stacks of new journals, pages filled with philosophical reflections, moral theories, and cold rationalizations. She was still writing, still experimenting, at least on paper. She called her time in prison a continuation of her research, as if cruelty were a science, as if suffering were a syllabus, as if what she'd done was teaching. But prison has a way of silencing even the most persistent voices, and slowly, quietly, Guadalupe faded. She died in custody in 1899, 6 years into her sentence after refusing food for several weeks. Her cause of death was listed as voluntary inanition. Hunger, yes, but chosen. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave behind the prison chapel. No mourners, no procession, no name, and yet she's not forgotten, because the images remain, the testimonies, the court records, the stories whispered in quiet towns across central Mexico, and of course the drawings, Posada's engravings, still studied by artists and historians. Guadalupe seated calmly in her chamber, the mask of civility peeled back just enough to reveal the monster underneath. The inmates of Cárcel de Belén were no strangers to violence. They had stolen, fought, killed, but even they had limits. Word of Guadalupe Bejarano's crimes spread through the prison like wildfire. And among the murderers' pickpockets and prostitutes, she became something worse than a pariah. She was reviled not for her wealth or her betrayal of privilege, but for what she had done to children. She was forced into 23-hour solitary confinement, not to protect her, but to prevent a riot. The 1 hour she was allowed into the narrow courtyard was accompanied by curses, spitting, and stones. No inmate offered her kindness, and the guards, many with daughters of their own, made no effort to shield her. But the greatest cruelty wasn't the scorn of others, it was the silence inside her cell. Guadalupe, for the first time in her life, had no one to command, no one to manipulate, no one to fear her, and without an audience, she unraveled. She had once ruled salons with grace and dominance. Now her hair matted to her temples. Her nails grew cracked and unpolished. Her once steady voice collapsed into hoarse pleading. She who had thrived in control found herself utterly powerless. The woman who had orchestrated every gesture, every scream, every silence, now cried quietly at night, unseen and ignored. The conditions of her imprisonment eroded her mind faster than age or illness ever could. And in the winter of 1895, just 2 years into her sentence, Guadalupe died. The official report listed pneumonia, but unofficially, guards admitted her body bore marks, bruises, a split lip, signs not of illness but of justice prison style. No charges were filed, no investigation conducted. There was no vigil. Her body lay unclaimed. Her funeral attended only by a priest who read the rites not out of compassion but duty. There were no flowers, no obituary beyond a one-line note in the city gazette. She was buried in an unmarked grave. The woman who once commanded respect from archbishops and statesmen was lowered into the dirt like a stray dog. Just as her victims had disappeared into silence, so did she. But while Guadalupe faded, her crimes refused to. Her case left scars on Mexico's conscience and on its institutions. It shattered the illusion that evil comes only from desperation or poverty. For the first time, a nation had to acknowledge that cruelty can wear perfume, that predators can carry rosaries, that the most monstrous hands may be manicured. The investigation revealed painful truths: that missing girls from poor families had been dismissed by police, ignored by officials, and forgotten by newspapers; that doctors sold torture equipment without question; that priests blessed a household where screams echoed through walls; and most chilling of all, that many of Mexico City's most powerful citizens had suspected what was happening and said nothing. Reputation had been more important than life, but out of that horror reform took root. New laws required every missing persons report to be investigated regardless of status. Medical professionals were placed under stricter scrutiny, and the legal category of serial murder, previously unrecognized, was formally defined and penalized. Yet, perhaps the deepest change was not legal but cultural. José Guadalupe Posada ensured that his etchings of Guadalupe Bejarano, drawn not as a monster but as a composed, respectable lady, entered Mexican folklore, not as fiction but as warning. They became schoolhouse prints, marketplace flyers, wall art in poor homes, and editorial pieces in wealthy salons. They taught a bitter truth: that evil does not announce itself. It slips through the door in silk. It smiles. It donates. It offers opportunity to the desperate and waits Decades later, when laborers began to renovate the Bejarano home, they uncovered the basement. Still intact, still carrying the scent of rot in its walls, still whispering, some claimed, with echoes of screams. The structure was torn down. But neighbors swore on quiet nights you could still hear them. So we end, not with Guadalupe Bejarano's death, but with her lesson that the true danger is rarely the obvious monster. It is the charming benefactor, the respected matron, the helpful stranger. Predators like Guadalupe don't rely on brute force. They rely on our doubt, our refusal to believe that someone so polished could be so cruel. They hide behind the systems meant to protect us and count on our silence to shield them. So we ask you, what do you believe? Were all of Guadalupe's secrets ever truly uncovered? Or did she carry darker truths to her unmarked grave? Leave a comment below. Share your thoughts about how we as a society might better protect those without voice, without power, and without protection. If you found this story compelling and want more journeys into the forgotten shadows of human history, subscribe to Sleepy History Tales. Click the bell, share with a friend, and drift with us into the forgotten corners, where truth still lingers. Until next time, sleep well. And don't forget, even the most familiar face may still wear a mask.